I'll just look over here, detective.
Yeah.
A serial killer in Texas goes undetected for 11 years.
Yeah,
Police identify a suspect, but their case must be pulled from the trash. Investigators hope new forensic techniques can establish a link among the murders and put an end to the violent rampage. In California, a missing persons case leads detectives to a secret burial ground at a Sacramento boarding house. An unlikely suspect becomes the focus of a mass murder investigation. Can science help unmask the murderer hiding behind a kindly face? Homicide investigators find that things aren't always what they appear to be. Seemingly insignificant clues may expose a pattern and put police on the trail of a killer whose compulsion is to kill again. On the morning of December 21st, 1984, in Wichita Falls, Texas, Lisa Boone returned home from her job at a local hospital and found herself locked out. Lisa asked her landlady to unlock the apartment. She'd given her keys to Terry Sims, a friend and co-worker who was spending the night.
Terry?
But Terry wasn't answering the door.
Terry?
Inside, the women found the apartment had been ransacked. Lisa called out to Terry, but got no response.
Terry! I didn't hear. Oh, Terry?
The landlady noticed blood on the floor and followed the trail. It led to Terry Sims' body. Officers from the Wichita Falls Police Department responded to the scene. Upstairs, they found the 20-year-old victim dead on the bathroom floor. She was nude except for socks. Her hands had been tied behind her back. Police processed the scene, looking for any clue that might identify the killer. They collected blood samples, a pair of white tennis shoes with the laces still tied, and a woman's hospital uniform. They also recovered a blood-stained bedspread and sheets. At the police station, Lisa told detectives that she and Terry Sims left the hospital together after working the 3 to 11 shift. She explained that she was also a part-time student at Midwestern State University and had an exam the next day. Terry was going to stay the night at Lisa's apartment to help her study in the morning. But Lisa said the hospital was short-staffed that night, so she volunteered for an extra shift. She dropped her friend off at the apartment around 12:30, gave Terry her keys, and returned to work.
When was the last time you saw her?
Lisa told police she'd arrived back home around 7 a.m. and knocked on the door. She had no idea who could have murdered her friend. An autopsy was performed on Terry Sims, and cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. While there was no sign of forcible rape, biological evidence was collected from the victim's body.
Excuse me, detective?
Most murder victims know their killers, so Wichita Falls police began interviewing Terry Sims' family and friends.
About Tony?
They quickly focused on her ex-boyfriend. He denied involvement. Investigators had little evidence against him, but they had a new forensic tool in their arsenal. In 1984, DNA profiling was in its infancy and held the potential to link a killer to his crime through biological evidence left at the scene. But large amounts of evidence were needed to successfully perform the tests. Hoping samples recovered in Terry Sims' case might identify her murderer, police submitted them to the Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. But their hopes were soon dashed. There wasn't enough material for DNA testing. With no hard evidence linking a suspect to the murder, the investigation stalled, and the case remained unsolved. On February 15, 1985, 2 months after Terry Sims was found murdered, an electric company employee was working on a transformer just outside the Wichita Falls city limits. He made a horrifying discovery. He stumbled upon a woman's body. He called 911. Deputies from the Archer County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. In the woods, they found the victim. Nearby, they recovered a leather jacket, a blood-stained nurse's uniform, and a pair of sneakers with the laces still tied. A search of police databases turned up a missing person fitting the victim's description. An autopsy confirmed her identity as Toni Gibbs, a 23-year-old nurse from Wichita Falls, reported missing by her brother a month earlier. The pathologist determined that she died from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Biological evidence was collected from the victim's body. Archer County investigators developed several suspects. They soon focused on a man named Danny Wayne Laughlin. He was the last person seen with Toni Gibbs. He had also been held on suspicion of rape in Kansas City, Missouri, less than a year before. Laughlin denied killing Toni Gibbs, but 3 separate polygraph tests suggested deception. At investigators' request, he provided blood and hair samples for DNA testing. Though the results were inconclusive, police believed they had the right man. Laughlin stood trial for the murder of Toni Gibbs. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. A mistrial was declared. Laughlin was never tried again. The Gibbs case remained open. On October 10, 1985, a maintenance worker was cutting grass alongside a road in Wichita County. In the overgrowth, he discovered a woman's body. He called the Wichita County Sheriff's Department. When deputies responded, they found the body of a woman, nude except for one sock. There were no clues as to the victim's identity. Police searched the surrounding area and found her clothing nearby. They also recovered a pair of sneakers with the laces tied. An autopsy was performed, but advanced decomposition made it difficult to determine how the woman died. Based on available evidence, however, the medical examiner concluded the cause of death to be undetermined homicidal violence. Wichita County Sheriff's deputies determined that the victim fit the description of a woman reported missing a month earlier. She She was identified as 21-year-old Ellen Blau. They interviewed two suspects who had been with her the night she was last seen. But deputies had insufficient evidence to charge them.
Yeah, no.
After several months, the case remained unsolved. While the three cases were investigated by different law enforcement agencies, they all fell under the jurisdiction of the Wichita County District Attorney's Office. Barry Maka had recently been elected district attorney and took over just days after Terry Sims' murder. The unsolved murders haunted him.
The absolute terror that they went through in the final minutes of their lives motivated me to find the person responsible for their deaths.
But investigators in each of the cases had exhausted all their leads, and there was nothing more Maka could do. More than a decade would pass before there was a break in the unsolved murders. By 1996, more than 11 years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Texas. Police still had no viable suspects in any of the murders. But improved forensic procedures prompted the Wichita County District Attorney to request a re-examination of the evidence from two of the three murders. Some of the evidence was sent to Glenn Unash, a latent print examiner at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin. He found a partial print on a sneaker recovered from the Terry Sims murder scene that had gone undetected. It didn't belong to Terry Sims. However, there was insufficient detail to make a comprehensive analysis. Because blood will darken as it absorbs the light, Unash hoped more ridge characteristics would emerge under laser light. He was disappointed. There was one more option, a dye staining technique. But there was a risk involved.
The dye staining technique could possibly destroy what is there, so the print was photographed prior to that. Once I got that photograph back, I examined it to make sure I recorded all the characteristics.
Unash was now ready to try the dye staining process. He saturated the print with amino black, which reacts to proteins in blood and turns them dark blue or black. But the process didn't develop any further ridge detail. The evidence enhancement he had hoped for eluded him. Over the next 3 years, he examined a series of suspect prints provided by the Wichita County District Attorney's Office and compared them to the one found on Terry Sims' sneaker.
I did not identify any of the suspects that they had sent me. Reported to them that the print appears to be partial second, third joint or another area of the palm. They started sending me in some palm prints. I made those comparisons. I still did not identify the print.
At the same time, DNA testing of the biological samples from the Sims and Gibbs cases was again underway at GeneScreen in Dallas. A new technology, PCR analysis, could provide forensic scientist Judy Floyd with more conclusive results than previous tests.
The requirements were not as stringent, and therefore we were able to use this very old, very degraded DNA and obtain a genetic profile of the perpetrator.
The new DNA process eliminated all previous suspects, including Danny Wayne Laughlin, who had stood trial for the murder of Tony Gibbs a decade earlier. But it did turn up a startling piece of evidence. Biological samples recovered from both victims came from the same individual. Emerging technology and improved forensics had linked two apparently unrelated cases. Now there was evidence a serial killer had claimed the lives of Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs. District Attorney Barry Maka wondered if some of the other unsolved cases were related. He began taking a closer look at those files. One caught his attention, that of Ellen Blau. Maka noted that circumstances of her murder were similar to the Sims and Gibbs homicides. Down to the sneakers, laces still tied, found by her nude body. On January 12, 1999, Maka asked his investigator, John Little, to review the three cases and try to develop a suspect. He also gave Little a possible lead. Though the victims had been discovered in 3 different police jurisdictions, they all lived within a relatively small geographical area.
Because of the close proximity, I felt that the person responsible for their deaths had some connection to that neighborhood. And so I emphasized that to John and asked him to review the files and see if he could establish anyone with a connection to the neighborhood that may be involved in the cases.
Little began by probing for common threads among the women. It didn't take him long to find them. He noticed that they all shared several physical characteristics.
All the victims were around the same age, pretty much the same build. They were all around 5 foot tall, not much taller. They all weighed 120 pounds or less. They all seemed to have pretty much the same features.
A distinct pattern was emerging, suggesting all 3 women had been killed by the same person. Then he found a name in the Ellen Blau file, a man named Farian Wardrip. While in custody on a murder charge back in 1986, Wardrip had told police that he knew Blau. It meant nothing to the police at the time. Little wondered if it meant anything now. He learned Wardrip had worked as an orderly at the same hospital as Tony Gibbs. And records showed that he had left that job 4 days after the first victim, Terry Sims, was found murdered. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more connections between Wardrip and the 3 women.
Hey John, this is right where...
He had lived in an apartment downstairs from Ellen Blau. That apartment was 2 blocks from the residence where Terry Sims was murdered. When Ellen Blau was murdered, Wardrip no longer lived at her apartment complex. He had moved to a residence across the street from the sub shop where she worked. Authorities had placed Wardrip in the neighborhood and established links between him and the victims. They were a long way from proving murder, but now they felt they were finally on the right track. A background check confirmed that Wardrip was a convicted murderer. He had confessed to killing a Wichita Falls woman in 1986. According to the records, he'd fled to Galveston, but turned himself in to police there. Sentenced to 35 years in prison, Wardrip had been paroled in 1997. During the 11 years he was incarcerated, there were no murders in Wichita Falls that were similar to those of Sims, Gibbs, or Blau.
And I felt like he was a very strong suspect, but the only way to find out for sure if he was the one responsible for these murders or not was to obtain a DNA sample.
Although circumstantial evidence pointed to Wardrip, it wasn't enough to obtain a court order to force him to provide DNA samples. Maka and Little decided to try to collect them surreptitiously. Their plan would require surveillance. Investigators contacted Wardrip's parole officer for information.
So where's he living?
They learned that Wardrip lived in nearby Alney, Texas, where he taught Sunday school and worked at a window screen company. According to the parole officer, Wardrip was being electronically monitored and was restricted to his apartment complex unless he was at work or church.
Appreciate it. Take care.
And that posed problems for investigators. For 3 days, they watched Wardrop at work behind a locked chain-link fence. He seemed to be beyond their reach. But on the 4th day, they got a break. On February 5th, 1999, the fence was unlocked and Wardrop was outside. He was with his wife, eating crackers and drinking coffee from a disposable cup. When he tossed the cup into a trash can just inside the gate, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The undercover investigator approached Wardrop and asked if he could get a tobacco spit cup. Wardrop told him to help himself. With that, any evidence obtained by investigators would be admissible in a court of law. He retrieved Wardrop's cup. Investigators hoped they now had their DNA sample. But would a few drops of coffee and cracker crumbs be enough to prove murder? More than a dozen years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Wichita Falls, Texas. Investigators had finally gathered physical evidence they hoped would prove Farian Wardrop was the killer. Now it was up to Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. Judy Floyd carefully swabbed the lip of the cup to collect Wardrop's saliva. When she compared that to DNA samples retrieved from the Sims and Gibbs murders, she was able to establish a match. And there was more. She discovered that Wardrop's profile was unique. He had not one, but 4 very rare markers in his genetic profile.
His profile was so rare that you would expect it to occur only one time in several thousand times the population of the Earth. And in effect, we were able to say that we have established identity with this particular individual to the evidence involved in Miss Sims and Miss Gibbs' case.
Investigators didn't stop there. At the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, Glenn Unash compared Wardrop's fingerprints to the partial print found on Terry Sims' sneaker. They matched. Besides making a positive identification, Unash could explain much more.
I can also determine how that shoe was held or when that print was left on that shoe. And it was in a direction that the defendant held the shoe or was taking the shoe off the victim's foot, somewhat similar to this, which would be consistent with pulling it off of a victim's foot.
Investigators' patience and ingenuity had paid off. It was time to take Wardrop into custody. They again enlisted the cooperation of his parole officer. On the pretense of a meeting, Wardrop was summoned to the parole office on February 13, 1999. When he arrived, police arrested Farian Wardrop and charged him with the murder of Terry Sims.
Yeah, all right.
Based on the evidence, police believe Wardrop saw Terry Sims at the door of Lisa Boone's apartment. After forcing his way inside, he tied her hands behind her back, then raped and killed her. Farian Wardrop pled guilty to the capital murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau. He was sentenced to death in the Sims case and received life terms in each of the others. Wardrop also confessed to an additional murder, In all, he had ended the lives of 5 young women. In Texas, a serial killer's guilt was contained in a disposable coffee cup. But on the West Coast, police would have to dig deeper for proof of murder. On November 7, 1988, in Sacramento, California, social worker Judy Moyes contacted Sacramento police about one of her clients, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. She said Bert had disappeared from the boarding house where she'd placed him. His landlady seemed unsure about his whereabouts. Ms. Moyes told police that Dorothea Puente's boarding house was a refuge for indigent people, many with histories of alcohol and drug abuse. It seemed ideal for Bert, a street person with no place to go. He had his own room and TV and was happy there after years of living on the streets. But after a few months, Bert started saying he wanted to leave. Judy Moyes hadn't heard from Bert in 3 months.
Bert, I have your mail.
Mrs. Puente finally explained that Bert had gone to live with his brother in Utah.
Hey, I see your medicine. Have you been taking it?
That made no sense to Judy Moyes. She knew Bert Montoya didn't have any family.
Yeah.
She asked police to look into it.
The reason I'm here today,
Officers
man,
went to interview Dorothea Puente. She seemed a gracious, grandmotherly woman, charming and eager to cooperate. She said Bert had gone to live with family in Utah.
I can't help
One of the
it.
residents in the boarding house corroborated the account.
I know who he is.
all right, well, appreciate your time.
But as the officer was leaving, the resident slipped him a note.
Thank you. Have a good day.
He wanted to talk. He told police that he'd seen some strange things at the house. Bert wasn't the only one who vanished. Another tenant, Ben Fink, had too. And there were others. But their Social Security checks kept coming. He also described a terrible odor around the boarding house. He said he'd once worked at a mortuary and recognized the smell of death.
Whereabouts are these holes?
The police officer filed a missing persons report on Bert Montoya. Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department was assigned the case. The name Dorothea Puente was familiar to him. She was known as a champion of the dispossessed.
She was highly respected for all of her charitable things that she had done to the Hispanic community. There were people that visited from other countries who came here to praise her and talk to her. And she was known in the Hispanic community as doctora, which is Spanish for doctor.
Now, Detective Cabrera requested a background check on Dorothea Puente. Based on her reputation, it wasn't what he expected. He learned that the kindly grandmother was actually only 59 years old and had a criminal history of preying on the elderly. She'd been previously convicted on multiple counts of forging Social Security checks and had served 4 years in prison. For investigators, her MO was surprising.
And she was getting these checks by putting knockout drops in these individuals' drinks. And of course, when they passed out, she took their check and signed it.
Conditions of Dorothea Puente's parole prohibited her from keeping a boarding house. That gave detectives a reason to look deeper into the situation. 4 days after Bert Montoya was reported missing, they met with Judy Moyes, hoping she could provide more information about the boarding house. She said most of the residents were poor, the forgotten elderly who exist on the fringes of society. But Dorothea Puente always had a place for them. And she had a reputation for treating tenants like family. Moyes claimed that several other social workers began to notice that their clients sometimes disappeared from the house, never to be seen again. Bert Montoya was the most recent. Perhaps some of the tenants had simply wandered off, or family members had decided to take care of them. Investigators decided to find out. Later that morning, police met with Dorothea Puente. Although they didn't have a warrant, she graciously gave them permission to conduct a search. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, police found prescription medication, a sedative in the name of Dorothy Miller.
She was related
Mrs.
to
Puente
me.
told them it belonged to a relative who had stayed with her for a while. Investigators asked if they could dig around in her backyard.
Happened, but of course the name Dorothy Miller, I just told you about.
Mrs. Puente not only gave them permission, she offered to get people in to dig for them.
Didn't even know it was there.
That didn't seem the action of a person with something to hide. Investigators declined her offer and began digging themselves. After finding nothing in 3 holes, they began to think they were wasting their time. But in the 4th, they found corrosive lime, often used to mask odors and speed decay. They decided to keep digging. To their surprise, they uncovered what appeared to be a human leg bone. At a boarding house for the elderly run by 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, Sacramento police uncovered human remains.
We need to get forensics here.
The coroner's office and a crime scene unit were dispatched to the scene. Puente agreed to accompany police to the station to make a statement. She was very cooperative and appeared genuinely shocked that bones were found in her yard. She said she had been living there for little more than a year. Perhaps the previous owner could explain the bones. But Puente's criminal past could not be ignored. Police asked her outright if she'd killed her missing tenant, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. Dorothea Puente calmly denied it. Since there was no evidence of any crime, investigators took Mrs. Puente home. The next morning, the search at the boarding house continued. As more police and excavation equipment arrived, curious onlookers and reporters began to assemble outside the house. Around 9:45, Mrs. Puente asked if she was free to go to the corner coffee shop. Since she'd been so cooperative and detectives had no proof of her involvement in any foul play, they let her go. 15 minutes later, at 10 a.m., forensic technicians uncovered a second body, wrapped in a tarp, buried under a cement slab. The condition of the tarp indicated that this body hadn't been underground very long. A police officer was dispatched to pick up Dorothea Puente at the coffee shop. She wasn't there.
We sent people over there to find out who had seen her, if anybody had talked to her, what was going on. They went over there and they had ascertained that she had got into a taxi cab and drove off.
Sacramento police traced the cab and learned it had taken her to the Stockton bus station, 50 miles away. There, they learned she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. Not knowing where she might be heading, investigators launched a nationwide search for Dorothea Puente. She She was now wanted on suspicion of murder. At the boarding house, authorities continued digging. Their search for missing person Bert Montoya had unearthed human remains of one victim and a second buried corpse. Mindful of statements that several residents had disappeared, police feared Mrs. Puente's yard might conceal more ugly secrets. The second body had been discovered under a cement slab that seemed out of place. Now they realized that several more sheds, slabs, and planters were oddly situated. They soon discovered the reason for that. Laura Santos, deputy coroner of Sacramento County, supervised the search.
Under every one of these odd-seeming things, like the sink, there was a body. Under the poorly poured piece of concrete, there was a body. Next to the shed that looked hastily assembled, there was a body.
After 3 days, the dig finally came to an end. 7 bodies had been uncovered in Dorothea Puente's yard. Police were dealing with a mass murderer. It seemed impossible that 7 people could have been buried right under the neighbors' noses without anyone seeing anything. Hoping for information or witnesses, detectives began interviewing Mrs. Puente's neighbors. It was hard to find anyone with anything negative to say about her.
It was like fighting an uphill battle. The community, first of all, did not want to accept the fact that this gray-haired little woman who they loved so much and who had given so much to the community was responsible for this gruesome task of putting these people in the yard.
While investigators canvassed the neighborhood, the grim task of identifying the 7 victims, 3 men and 4 women, was underway at the Sacramento coroner's office. All the bodies were x-rayed, then forensic pathologists performed autopsies on them. The coroner started with the victim most closely matching Bert Montoya's description. She began by carefully removing layers of wrapping and documenting each. The body, like many of the others, was wrapped in a signature way that suggested a methodical but twisted mind.
Sheets wrapped with duct tape, then quilts stitched together, blankets, then more sheets, more tarps. I remember there were blue tarps on a couple of the cases, and then each layer would somehow be secured either with twine or duct tape or actually stitched with thread. And then the entire bundle perhaps duct taped together.
The wrappings concealed advanced decomposition, which made it impossible to establish a cause of death for any of the victims. But because of the circumstances, all were ruled homicide. The condition of the bodies also prevented pathologists from immediately identifying any of the victims. As Dr. Santos explains,
most people are identified by fingerprints first, next by dental records, and then by other means. 4 out of the 7 bodies were too decomposed to get decent fingerprints from. None of them had any teeth, so the usual methods that we make an identification could not be used.
the tissue samples were sent to forensic labs for further analysis. To aid in identification efforts, investigators tried to locate people who had disappeared from the boarding house. They found the brother of 55-year-old Ben Fink, one of the tenants believed to be missing. But he told police he hadn't heard from Ben in 3 months. Investigators feared Ben Fink had already been found. To build their murder case against 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, police needed physical proof linking her to the victims' deaths. Investigators went through the boarding house again. They found twine, duct tape, and a coffee can with the word lie written on it. Police found dozens of bottles of the prescribed sedative Dalmane. That didn't seem unusual in a boarding house full of elderly people. But investigators noticed all of the Dalmane, although prescribed by several different doctors, was in Dorothea Puente's name. As details of the investigation became public, police began hearing from witnesses who helped them reconstruct an account of Dorothea Puente's daily routine. It seemed she had a penchant for pre-dawn gardening and became very angry if interrupted. They also learned that she insisted on personally collecting the mail every day, particularly at the end of the month.
She was always there to get the mail because, of course, the mail had the checks. And she would take the checks and keep control of all the money.
Investigators learned that nobody had questioned that control. Since most of the boarding house residents had drug or alcohol problems, it seemed a logical way to keep them from lapsing into their old habits. Police believed that by persuading residents to sign their monthly checks over to her, Mrs. Puente would be assured that the money would keep coming even after the tenants disappeared. In fact, she was getting 10 to 12 federal assistance checks each month, some for people who hadn't lived at the boarding house in years. Police believed money was the motive for murder, but they still needed to find their suspect. Despite the manhunt, Dorothea Puente was still at large. On November 16th, less than a week after she fled, investigators got a tip that Dorothea Puente was at a motel in Los Angeles. An elderly man called police when he saw her picture on TV. He'd recognized her as the woman who'd struck up a conversation about his Social Security benefits.
She wanted to know things like, how much he was getting, and was he taking, full benefit of receiving the money. And of course, he was inquisitive. But she had told him that she knew how to raise his money allotment.
Even as a fugitive, she couldn't resist the opportunity to cash in. Her greed had finally caught up with her. Dorothea Puente was finally in custody. Though they believed they knew her motive for the murders, police had no physical evidence linking her to them. In addition, the victims' identities were still unknown. A latent print examiner was brought in. He compared known samples to fingerprints from 3 of the bodies. He confirmed that one of the victims was Bert Montoya. He would soon identify Ben Fink and Dorothy Miller as well. Science had made a liar of Dorothea Puente. But there remained 4 victims without names. Police had compiled a list of 60 people who had received Social Security checks at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. They tried to track down every name on that list. They found most of the people still alive, having moved out of the house for a variety of reasons. But a few were still unaccounted for. They then assembled medical records on each missing person. The files were forwarded to the Sacramento coroner's office. There, forensic pathologists began the painstaking task of comparing x-rays of each body found in the yard to medical records from each of the missing persons. They looked for distinguishing characteristics in the records that could be linked to each victim.
We did find anomalies in the bodies, abnormalities, like one person had had skull surgery and had evidence that he'd had a craniotomy. And another person had irregular characteristics of one of her clavicles, and she'd also had some mandible lower jaw fractures in the past. And using that information from the bodies, we were then able to start making comparisons with the medical records we'd obtained from this list that Social Security had provided us.
The victims had all finally been identified. But police were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: how they died. Until that question could be answered, authorities would have a hard time proving murder. They hoped a forensic toxicologist could give them answers. In November of 1988, police investigating the murders of 7 people at a Sacramento boarding house enlisted the aid of toxicologist William Phillips at the California Department of Justice. With no obvious cause of death, they hoped he would be able to determine whether drugs or poisons had ended the victims' lives. Phillips began by analyzing all 7 victims' tissue samples with a radioamino acid, or RIA test, which is sensitive to classes of drugs. The test results showed all of the samples contained the sedative flurazepam, which is used widely in Dalmane, the drug found at Dorothy Apuente's boarding house. It is a potent sedative often prescribed for the elderly. It was the first physical evidence linking Puente to the deaths of the 7 victims. Next, Phillips subjected the samples to the tandem mass spectrometer, the only one on the West Coast at the time. The apparatus uses negative ion detection to find the characteristic profile or footprint of individual drugs. Besides detecting the presence of flurazepam, or Dalmane, in each sample, it also measured the drug's concentration. But because the bodies had been underground for varying periods of time, those concentrations did not necessarily reflect levels present at the time of death. Some of the drug could have seeped into the ground.
The drug, Dalmane, was present in all the samples, but the concentrations were so varied that no one could say whether or not the drug caused their death. But I was able to link all the samples, all the tissues, the brains, the liver tissues from all these victims to Dorothy Apuente.
Investigators believed they had enough evidence to charge Dorothy Apuente with the murder of her 7 tenants. Based on the evidence, police believe she would charm residents into giving her control of their money. If they were reluctant, she would invite them into her private rooms and give them a drink laced with drugs. Afterwards, she would methodically wrap the bodies and hire men to dig holes in her backyard. During her pre-dawn gardening, the 59-year-old woman managed to bury her victims. On August 15, 1993, Dorothy Apuente was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury was unable to reach verdicts on the other 4 charges. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Serial killers are methodical, skilled at covering their tracks in order to keep killing. But even the cleverest of predators cannot avoid detection for long. Today, forensic scientists, using sophisticated technology, are helping police stop deadly criminals with an urge to kill again. In small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years. waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class.
Bye.
A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington State must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Norridgewock, Maine, November 23, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but had not returned. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single hair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman.
It was dark, I didn't even...
The woman appeared to be asleep.
Anything else? I'll make sure that I...
Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug.
Thank you.
In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce.
No, sweetie, you need to go back to bed.
She had custody of her daughter, Julie.
Let me help you with that. You got that?
Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys.
All right.
All right.
Janet said she would be back in a few minutes.
Around midnight, she didn't show up.
When she failed to return, he phoned police. The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth. Detectives also questioned Baxter's ex-husband,
We're investigating a homicide that happened on November 23rd.
but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a suspect.
I was working that evening.
Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you? Good evening. I'm Detective Chick Love. I'd like to ask you a few questions.
A local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
No, you got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964.
Any different
Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning.
You observed that crime scene last night?
He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar.
There that day?
Yeah, on my way back.
They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot, the same one Janet Baxter had visited the night she was murdered. Cochran said he got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them. He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road.
Your hair, if you don't mind looking that over.
Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence.
Just relax.
Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved. But her family refused to let it go. "20 years had passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests had been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan, that somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents.
Detective Mike Mitchell. How do you do? State Police. He's here to
The detective had grown up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Well, Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police, and I just want
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigations. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lessard, and his cronies, who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My other two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all of that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter.
Now let's see what we've got. We've got the Volvo.
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slide surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter.
So both of them have last name. This one.
Oh wow, I see him.
Now the number of.
Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA tests. When the tests were concluded and the comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
When it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, you know, something you'll never forget.
Any idea of the date of birth?
It's going to be in March. I'm going to think March 17th, 1938, maybe. He's about 62 years old. Is this something?
But where was Albert Cochran?
What's the last name?
Cochran. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Yeah, I've been working hard on it. All right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milbrandt was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kenny's car was found across the roadway from his residence and had been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kinney's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
The ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank is closed, and the agents, the investigators, went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
Three days after her son disappeared, Kinney's mother received a second phone call.
Hello?
This time, investigators were listening.
Is my son okay?
Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of prints.
Okay, Melgar Park. Just a minute. Michael, right? He's fine. Can I talk to him? Until I get the money.
Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate his threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving, transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspects' flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk.
We got something here.
The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts.
The money? I'm telling you the truth.
Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota. Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him, and he was transported to the pre-arranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacob's story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael
The results of the
Kinney?
test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall
Is
truthfulness
your
of his
name
statements.
Todd Miller?
That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest.
Do you live at 123
Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception.
have anything to do with the disappearance?
Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother.
As well as a swell rep.
As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest,
This is where
but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. You know, all of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping murder, a homicide.
At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer, but now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part or the base bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the two hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample.
Mr. Miller?
Yes?
Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend.
How's it going, Mike? Hey, Todd.
Completely unaware of what was about to befall him,
Hey, Mike.
Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned.
What's up with the gun, man?
After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Todd Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a community near Preston, Washington, another missing persons case was to turn deadly. On September 4th, 1996, Rex and Shirley Wren reported their son, 35-year-old James Brad Wren, missing. They told police that their son's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was known to be violent. The parents told police that 2 months before, Marcel became enraged at their son while the two were working on the house they shared together. Wren left the residence so Marcel could cool off. When Wren returned later that night, Marcel shot him in the leg.
Oh my God!
Their son had refused to press charges. The information was enough for police to open a missing persons investigation. A background check revealed that police had been dispatched to Marcel and Wren's residence several times before to settle angry disputes between the two men. On August 10th, a month after the shooting, Wren called 911 to file a formal complaint against Marcel for another incident. He had not been seen since. Assigned to the Major Crimes Unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, Detective Denny Gula headed the investigation to locate the missing man.
The last time he was seen was with a King County police officer. There was a disturbance at his house, and Sergeant Bachmeyer, the patrol supervisor at that time, had contacted him at home and transported him to the Fall City substation.
Gula began by reviewing the responding officer's log of the August 10th incident. Records showed that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer had taken Wren to a nearby police station, taken a statement, then released him. Hoping for more detailed information, Detective Gula put in phone calls to Sergeant Bachmeyer. While waiting for a response, he continued his investigation. He questioned Wren's neighbors. One, Richard Pettygrove, recalled that the last time he saw Wren was on August 10th. He reported seeing Wren driven away in a police car following a fight between Wren and his roommate, Emmett Marcel.
A real angry
Richard
person.
described Emmett Marcel as a dangerous and angry person. All of the neighbors felt certain Marcel had something to do with Wren's disappearance.
My business cards.
Detective Gula ran Marcel's name through the law enforcement database. Marcel had recently been put in a Tacoma jail for an unrelated traffic violation.
Check on license plate.
For investigators, it was time to pay a visit to the prime suspect in James Wren's disappearance.
CCU. Okay, thank you.
Police
very
in
much.
King County, Washington searched for 35-year-old James Brad Wren, reported missing by his parents. Wren's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was quickly becoming the prime suspect. Police went to question him in a Tacoma jail, where he sat for unrelated traffic violations.
Is your name Emmett Marcel? Yes.
Marcel agreed to take a polygraph. He appeared unconcerned and claimed to have no idea about where Wren might be.
Did you or did you not?
On the evening of August 10th, the day Wren was last seen, Emmett claimed he was with a friend in nearby Tukwila, Washington.
You do not know why you.
Though the polygraph strongly indicated he was telling the truth, investigators were unconvinced. They obtained warrants to search Marcel's car. On the floorboard, investigators found a prescription bottle with Wren's name on it. They also found a hammer with a reddish-brown substance on it. In the lab, samples of the reddish-brown flecks on the hammer were tested, but no conclusive results could be reached. The samples were too deteriorated. The case against Marcel seemed to be going nowhere. A search warrant was obtained for Marcel and Wren's residence.
See anything else out of the unusual?
Inside, a suspicious stain on the carpet drew the investigators' attention. Samples of the stain were preserved on swabs. Detectives hoped this was the break they needed.
We're thinking that this is a pretty substantial piece of evidence. We sent it off to the crime lab for processing. And what we find out is that it's bovine or cow's blood.
With no physical evidence tying Marcel to Wren's disappearance, he was eliminated as a suspect. They hoped that Officer Bachmeyer, who had taken Wren's statement on August 10th, could shed some light on the disappearance. After several weeks, Bachmeyer finally contacted detectives and came in for questioning. He apologized for the delay, saying he was under a lot of pressure, which was recently compounded when his home had been burglarized and set on fire. In fact, he explained that when he responded to the 911 on August 10th, he recognized Wren. Bachmeyer was certain Wren was the person he had seen fleeing from his house after it had caught fire. When Wren was brought in to file his complaint, Bachmeyer confronted him about the arson. Wren admitted to the crimes. But after writing out his confession, Wren stormed out of the station. For Detective Gula, Bachmeyer's story seemed odd.
You know, people just don't storm off and walk out of the police station, especially when this person has just admitted to you to have burned your house down.
Okay, now let's try to...
Though it was unclear if Bachmeyer was involved in Wren's disappearance, investigators decided to take a closer look into the arson and burglary at his home. Detective Gula met with the Renton PD arson investigators who had been the first to look into the fire at Bachmeyer's house. After first believing the motive behind the fire was possibly an act of revenge by a criminal, they were now convinced Bachmeyer had set the fire himself. The arsonist had used flares stuck in plastic containers to start the blaze, a method that would give the perpetrator plenty of time to leave the scene before the fire actually caught. The investigation further revealed numerous valuable items, including jewelry, limited edition prints, CDs, and leather jackets, had been removed from the house prior to the fire and stored in the garage to avoid being damaged. King County Sheriff's Detective Sue Peters also worked the investigation.
Basically, Renton police detectives were concerned and thought Bachmeyer possibly could be a suspect because one of the neighbor ladies had actually seen what she believed was Sergeant Bachmeyer leaving on his motorcycle in the middle of the night, and then several minutes later, his house is on fire.
Due to all of the conflicting circumstances, Bachmeyer's insurance company had refused to pay his claim unless he took a polygraph, something he refused to do. He was stripped of his badge and gun and was suspended from the department. He was now the prime suspect in Wren's disappearance. But police had no motive and no body to suggest a crime had taken place. Investigators would have to outsmart a man who knew how to hide evidence. Police in Washington State were beginning to suspect that fellow officer Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the disappearance of 35-year-old James Brad Wren. According to Bachmeyer, Wren had confessed to torching and burglarizing the officer's home just before he disappeared. A copy of Wren's confession to Sergeant Bachmeyer was obtained. Each page bore Wren's signature. The statement and the signatures, however, appeared to be written in a different hand. But it was not unusual for an investigator to write out a story and have a suspect sign it. To be sure, the confession was sent to a handwriting expert. Examiners determined that the signature at the bottom of each page was in Wren's handwriting, while the statement itself was in Bachmeyer's. But the analysis revealed something more interesting. Though the entire statement was written in the same color ink, one type of pen had been used to write the first two pages, which pertained to Wren's complaint about Emmett Marcel, but pages 3, 4, and 5 had been written with a different pen. Those pages contained Wren's confession to the arson and burglary. For investigators, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge.
It was my belief that Brad Wren was going to be used as the suspect of the arson, which he was, according to Sergeant Bachmeyer. And, you know, the case is really all tied together, that Sergeant Bachmeyer was becoming the focus of the arson of his own home, And so he needed to find someone that he could say set his house on fire to clear him. So he picked Brad Wren, who led a very simple life.
Search warrants were obtained for the patrol car Sergeant Bachmeyer used on the evening of August 10th. Small reddish-brown stains were found on the back seat and armrest of the patrol car. The rear seat covering was removed. Investigators were shocked to discover a much bigger stain in the foam padding. It appeared a large amount of substance had seeped through the upholstery and into the cushion. Samples of each stain were taken to the crime lab. They all tested positive for human blood. When confronted about the evidence, Bachmeyer stated Wren had experienced a nosebleed while in the patrol car.
You being the one.
Police didn't buy it. Examiners developed experiments to determine how much blood it would take to leave such a large stain under the patrol car's rear seat. By using different amounts of human blood to soak back seats from similar patrol cars, criminalists ascertained the absorption rate of the foam padding and the amount of blood needed to make a similar size stain. They determined that a minimum of 200 milliliters, or nearly a cup of blood, was involved. Far more than even the worst nosebleed would produce. Examiners had to prove that the blood in the patrol car came from Wren. But without a body, there were no samples to compare. It fell to forensic chemist Kim Duddy to find a way around that problem.
Both his biological parents were still alive and were willing to give blood samples. So our DNA unit took the blood samples from both his biological mother and father and tested it to the question stain on the seat from Bachmeyer's vehicle.
The DNA analysis showed that the blood from Bachmeyer's patrol car had come from the biological child of Rex and Shirley Wren. Even without a body, the evidence was now overwhelming that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the murder of James Wren. The veteran police officer was arrested. If any doubt remained, it was cleared up on February 2nd, 1997, less than 3 months after Bachmeyer's arrest. Bone and clothing fragments were found near a secluded cul-de-sac in Cougar Mountain Park. Among the most identifiable pieces were a skull and a red, white, and blue cast. Keys to the gated park were found on Bachmeyer's keychain. Police believe that Sergeant Bachmeyer's scheme to make some easy cash by setting up a phony arson of his home backfired when his insurance company became suspicious. He needed to prove to them that criminal forces were out to get him. Wren became a patsy in his twisted plan. Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Killers who strike without remorse, whose motives are obscure, can frustrate detectives in their efforts to solve a case. But dogged investigation, coupled with patience and the ever-advancing scientific methods of the crime lab, can often produce results, no matter how cold-blooded the crime.